Greetings, friends of liberty. When we think through the history of ideas, and those of both philosophy and religion, and contemplate how one set might conquer another, as happened during the fall of the Roman Empire, when Christian beliefs and practices rendered those of the pagans extinct, in understanding that process, we would do well to remember how I myself confronted a gang of 4 ruffians one day whilst walking through the streets of Westminster. I had returned from a mission in France with 7 members of the League, but bade them well to attend to further League business in another area of the city. They looked at me briefly, inquiring politely as to my welfare whilst travelling alone, but I assured them that I would be quite all right. Nonetheless, proceeding through an area close to Westminster, I came upon a gang of 4 ruffians in a pocket somewhat distant from their normal haunts. I, having affected a somewhat mincing style, when approaching them, their leader, looking amusingly around at his partners in crime, was careless in taking too much liberty in accosting me when demanding that I empty my pockets, he desiring that I make for him a benefaction of their contents. Whereupon I, quickly drawing my sword, struck him through the shoulder of his sword arm, rendering him defenseless, a bloody injury indeed, and laying him low with a sharp elbow to the face. His comrades, 2 of them armed only with small cudgels, seeing the evident skill in my swordplay, quickly fled. And so I, wiping his blood off of my sword, concluded by extending my card upon the sword tip to the groaning man on the ground, saying, "Sir Percy Blakeney, at your service, sir." He still had manners enough to hold out his remaining good arm to remove the card, though with an expression of pained and doubtful inquiry. I would submit to you that the leaders of various religious denominations, as cunning as they can be, with their bland-faced deceptions, often employ a similar tactic. A case in point, the introduction of Christianity into England. When first Christian missionaries came to England, to whom did they make their appeals? To our kings. They knew well where to strike. And so Pope Gregory I in 597, do excuse me, sent St. Augustine, number 2 of Canterbury, not the resurrected corpse of Hippo, to Kent. And to whom did Augustine, number 2, immediately attend? King Ethelbert of Kent, of course, converting him within the year. And not only was Ethelbert king, but he was also a Bretwalda, a regional overlord, which meant that when he became Christian, he was perfectly placed to influence under-kings to become Christian as well, as he did with his nephew, King Sabert of the East Saxons. Similarly, King Edwin of Northumbria married Ethelbert's daughter in 625 and became a Christian in 627, helping to spread Christianity throughout much of the North Country. Now, do you not imagine that the kings did not use their money and power and patronage to privilege Christians? And do you not imagine that it was held as a kind of custom that the lower orders, such as the slaves or serfs, and even many others higher up, would sometimes be expected to follow the lead of their lord, or would find it at least convenient to do so? And do you imagine that the churchly bishops, such as Augustine, shed many a tear when churches were funded and built directly on top of pagan shrines or holy sites? Would they have availed themselves much of their handkerchiefs, do you think? Now we turn to the question of the conversion of the pagans, even earlier in the Roman Empire, as argued in great detail in your own 21st century by King's College historian of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Peter Heather, excuse me, we see some of the same tactics used, not only by Roman leaders, but Islamic as well. Heather in Christendom, the Triumph of a Religion, 300 AD to 1300, focuses with laser precision on the process by which the beliefs of a simple prophet from Galilee came to dominate all of Europe's 90 million souls. Heather begins, almost at the end in 1250, by describing the virtual triumph of the papacy, when, after the Crusades in the Baltics, Grand Duke Mindaugas of Lithuania was baptized into Christianity. He was duly rewarded. Pope Innocent IV promoted his duchy to the rank of kingdom. With this, yet another piece of the papal realm fell into place. Not surprisingly, 2 years later, at the height of his papal powers, that same pope had promulgated the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, which authorized torture and the interrogation of heretics right across the lands. This was a very far cry from earlier times when, as late as 300 AD, at the time of Constantine's conversion, Christianity possessed no central authority structure at all. And for centuries later, the truth was that emperors and kings exercised much greater actual religious authority than any pope, and not just in practice, but also by right, since it was generally accepted that Christian rulers were directly appointed by the Almighty. One of the greatest and most historically important of these was the aforementioned Emperor Constantine, who was deeply embroiled in his own game of thrones. Proclaiming himself emperor in 306, in 312, Constantine famously claimed he saw a kind of sign of the cross, which may have been a form of solar halo, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. It was accompanied by the words, "By this sign, conquer." And conquer in the name of Christianity he did. By 324, he had eliminated all other rivals to the throne. Living in a superstitious age, these very victories were persuasive to many pagans that whomever the supreme god was, whether Apollo, Sol Invictus, or Mithra, he obviously had supported Constantine by letting him win all those decisive battles. Heather believes it likely that Constantine was always a closet Christian, finally coming out in 324, just the same as the later pagan emperor Julian came out only 6 years after becoming emperor himself in 355. How many Romans were Christians in 300 AD? Heather argues very few, since up to 90% of Romans lived in the countryside and Christianity was overwhelmingly urban. As he says, if only a third of the urban populations, representing about 10% of the empire's total population, had substantial organized Christian communities, and if in these Christians did not yet form a majority, Christian numbers circa 300 cannot have been anywhere near the claimed 10%. At most, no more than 1 or 2% of the total imperial population. Heather thus casts doubt on the statistical models often used, whereby, like contagious diseases, Christianity expands by 40% per year for 250 years to reach 10% by 300 AD. One of the primary examples of Constantine throwing his imperial weight around was during the controversy over the adoption of the Nicene Creed, a controversy between the followers of Arius, who believed that Jesus was not quite equal in supernatural stature to God the Father, and the followers of Athanasius, who believed they were equal. How did Constantine decide the issue? He simply stipulated at the end of the council held to decide it that the beliefs of Arius were to be condemned. As Heather says, for the first time a local variety in belief, implicitly tolerated, had been suppressed in favor of a top-down prescription. Administratively a first in the history of the Church, which in its earlier days had, of necessity, allowed, if not supported, a wide variety of biblical and theological interpretations and sects. And what happened to those banned heretical Christian churches like the Arian? Their properties were confiscated and their clerical leaders sent into exile, while rich lay supporters were fined large sums of gold and banned from careers in the imperial service. The beliefs of the church overall were also influenced by the large and growing influx of people, and so the early church now also at times gave up on strenuous punishments for sins, since the standard for Christian behavior was allowed to drop to accommodate the sometimes lower standards of the many newcomers. But those who wanted to live a more ascetic life and who rejected the world were increasingly able to find that life in monasteries, which collected and isolated such religious recluses. Partly to finance the increased military expenditures of the 3rd century, in which the size of the army grew by over 50%, the Roman state looked for new sources of revenue, one being the ancient wealth of Egyptian pagan temples, which were simply confiscated, essentially destroying the religion. But more importantly, what was the role of government after Constantine's final victory in 324 in privileging Christian beliefs? As Heather puts it, why did Christian conversion gather pace, especially among the Roman imperial elite in the decades after Constantine's declaration of a Christian allegiance, when again, likely at most, only 2% of Romans were Christian? It did for the following reasons. Firstly, before this period, if barbarian town elites supported the imperial cult of divine emperors, they were granted Roman citizenship, which opened up many advantages. Similarly, this second Roman cultural revolution of the 4th and 5th centuries, which saw provincial landowning elites adopt Christianity in large numbers, bears close comparison with the predecessor, which had so effectively transformed its barbarian ancestors into good Romans. Secondly, from about 250 onwards, the emperors were involved in most new laws or decisions regarding land use. And since most wealth was held as land, landowning elites didn't want to get on his bad side. Thirdly, to pay for the increased military expenditures, a new tax system came into being, which meant that every 15 years everyone's property tax was reassessed. And again, wanting to stay on the good side of the assessors, being Christian in the 4th century became a plus. Fourthly, in order to run this new tax system, there was a huge expansion in the imperial bureaucracy, on the order of 20 times, from about 250 total administrators in 250 AD to about 6,000 a century or more later. So in order to be successful, you wanted to have the most connections possible within that bureaucratic system for the lowest tax assessments, for favorable legal decisions, and for general bribery purposes. As Heather says, because Constantine and his sons, if less directly, were able to pass on their imperial power to Christian successors, Christian emperors subsequently controlled the distribution of favors for the bulk of the 4th century. But how many of these elites who said they believed truly did? In addition, the significant Christian destruction of pagan temples encompassed cities from Alexandria to Gaza to Delphi to Palmyra to Ephesus and Carthage, many instigated by the actions of powerful regional bishops and their squadron of filthy, violent, lawless monks. As Heather summarizes, by the 5th century, the state-sponsored shutting down of pagan religion in all its manifestations was so well established that bishops and monks were pretty much free to do as they pleased. Note also again that the angry violence that Christians turned against pagans was also turned against heretical Christians, the Donatists, the Arians, the Montanists, and many others. In fact, the Christians often exhibited such hatred of each other that the later pagan emperor, Julian the Apostate, thought to destroy Christianity simply by turning all these different sects against each other. In part 2, excuse me, Heather deals with Christianity during and after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Some of the more notable events and incidents were the following. In 376, the barbarian people Tervingi, fleeing from the Huns in the east, were given shelter within the empire's borders by the Emperor Valens, one of his conditions being that the tribal elite accept Christianity. Sure, why not? That's a hell of a lot better than having your head chopped off by the Huns. Eventually, the whole tribe converted. In 381, the Emperor Theodosius dictated that everyone should accept a certain modified formulation of the Nicene Creed. Everyone except the Goths obeyed him. But the problem with the Gothic unapproved version of Christianity, called the Homoian version, was that it spread to everyone else in their vicinity. The Vandals and Alans, Burgundians, Heruli, Gepids, and Ostrogoths. Partly this happened simply because Gothic Bible translations existed, which meant they could actually understand the Bible. Now, not only did the Gothic Homoian version of Christianity spread to so many barbarian tribes, but then, when the leader of the Vandals and Alans, Gaiseric, conquered North Africa, and his son Huneric started persecuting the Orthodox version of Christianity, many bishops there abandoned the Roman version and flocked to his. Here too, just as in so many other instances, the elites jumped the religious ship like scared rats. Reputedly, even Clovis, the king of the Franks himself, was undecided as to which version of Christianity to accept. However, after the brilliant general Belisarius invaded North Africa, the whole Vandal kingdom collapsed, and by 600, support for its Gothic version of Christianity had as well. When we turn to the eastern part of Christianity, swallowed up by Islam, much of it, we see that Nestorian versions of Christianity abounded, in which, for example, Jesus is called the Son of Mary, not the Son of God, and regarded as more human. But as the centuries passed, the onerous restrictions placed upon Christians, such as in paying the poll tax, being forced to wear identifying clothing, being forbidden to try to convert Muslims, being banned from ringing church bells, and other humiliations increased, resulting in many Islamic conversions. If we turn now to the Roman abandonment of Britain and the subsequent attempts to convert or reconvert the island in 597, Heather notes, number one, how few missionaries there were, apparently around 40, and number two, how, as I mentioned in the beginning, missionary work in the post-Roman West was fundamentally a top-down process, heavily reliant on winning over local rulers to the cause. Typical was the case of St. Patrick, who in Ireland went directly to the country's many kings, working first and foremost to convince them of the value of his religion. Similarly, on the other side of the Irish Sea, the Anglo-Saxon kings exercised extensive powers of patronage over their leading warriors. The warriors, in turn, once established as estate holders with their own dependent peasants, were then well placed to pass the favor on down the social scale. Did these coercive methods work? A letter of Pope Gregory to his fellow patriarch of Alexandria tells us that the combined efforts of Augustine and his monks brought 10,000 individuals to baptism on Christmas Day, 597. Of course, syncretism, which is the blending of two religions together, which psychologically makes it easier for people to move from one to the other, was often on display. As Heather says, it was not until the 10th century that Anglo-Saxons stopped illustrating Christ as an armored warrior. Pope Gregory himself likely had the clever idea to substitute Christian saints and their worship in place of the old Anglo-Saxon magic rituals that allegedly achieved cures and influenced worldly events. And even as late as the year 1000, Icelanders agreed to accept Christianity only if they could continue to eat horse flesh, abandon any unwanted children, and sacrifice to the old gods in private. Along with Christian force also came deception. Heather doesn't neglect describing some of the many forgeries and deceptions of the church, with up to a quarter of all monastic charters being forged. Among the most famous general forgeries were the so-called Clementine recognitions, which claim Peter had transferred his supernatural authority to Pope Clement. B, the donation of Constantine, the argument based on forged documents that back in the 4th century the Roman Emperor Constantine had granted control of the entire Western Empire to Pope Sylvester. And C, the most accomplished and comprehensive forgery of all, the pseudo-Isidorian, by which Frankish clerics in Reims or Trier produced hundreds of fake documents supporting papal supremacy and protecting bishops from secular rulers and archbishops. Heather finally turns to the gradual but in the end enormous increase in papal authority and power gained from the late Roman period to the High Middle Ages. He remarks that, number one, in 1150 AD, popes issued 30 decretals a year, decretals being authoritative rulings on issues of canon law. Whereas in Roman times, they'd only issued one decretal every 3 years, and that only when they were asked. Number two, the church and popes began to try to justify their power-grabbing decisions based on earlier papal and canon law rulings. But as mentioned previously, most major religious decisions previously were not made by popes anyway, but by kings and regional rulers, they believing that God Almighty had appointed them to their station. Charlemagne was a typical example of this. Number three, by 754, the papal states were founded, and the popes, increasingly thinking themselves quite high and mighty, tried to convince Frankish King Charlemagne, who had gone to the trouble of conquering huge swaths of European territory, that his success was due to the Pope's divine influence. But this, Charlemagne knew, was bogus. For what Charlemagne had done himself was first brutally conquering the Saxons, then in sponsoring missionaries to Sweden and Norway, although it must be said that the Vikings and Slavs then and later proved highly resistant. In Poland, the same violence was employed by the Piast dynasty to establish the first Christian kingdom there. Ditto with the Kievan Rus, with mandatory baptism by the thousands occurring. In a nutshell, ruling dynasties in this period saw the geopolitical advantages of allying themselves with powerful Christian rulers like Charlemagne, becoming Christian themselves and forcing their subjects to convert. Number four, over time, the great income taken from all these conquered and Christianized pagan territories was used to build over 20,000 new churches and to reorganize mountains of old Latin documents, introducing the new Carolingian script in the process. By the middle of the 13th century, Roman authority was available in a comprehensive set of law books which could be transported even to the most far-flung locality. This income was also funneled to the Benedictines, Franciscans, and Dominicans, making these monastic orders ever more powerful and able to watch over everyone's thoughts and actions. Some of the many new theological innovations included A, the doctrine of the real presence in the host, B, the adoration of the host, C, masses for the dead, D, mandatory yearly confessions, E, in 1139, priestly celibacy, and F, the invention of purgatory. All these blatant fictions were imposed by the popes and Christian rulers on the masses. Number five, of course, the popes too unleashed their dogs of war. Duke William of Aquitaine, under a papal banner, to invade England, and other crusaders on the Baltics, Constantinople, and the Holy Lands. For his part, Pope Gregory VII supposedly urged on his soldiers with Jeremiah 48:10. Cursed be he that keepeth back his sword from blood. These were the paragons of Christian morality, shown in their true moral depravity. Heather ends, coming full circle, in recounting the persecution and silencing of reformers and dangerous thinkers like theologian Peter Abelard, the rich cloth merchant from the city of Lyon. Peter Waldo, he starting the Waldensian movement,
and the so-called umiliati, who were lay preachers in Italy. These latter two movements were harbingers of the Reformation, since they preached from the Bible according to their own understanding, not received doctrine. In conclusion, my last review dealt with Orthodox objectivist philosopher Leonard Peikoff's The Dim Hypothesis, and in part his astonishingly obtuse claim that the Church conquered the West not by physical but by spiritual means, by the power of its ideas over men's minds. This book, at least in part, directly refutes Peikoff's orthodox objectivist fiction. As Heather says, in the end, the fully fledged Christian one-party state of the high medieval Europe has to be seen as the culmination of a long history of more and less directly forced conversion. Over and over again, for close to a millennium, we see how Christianity used violence and deception in all forms to incentivize and motivate acceptance of its often nonsensical beliefs and practices. For that, as well as the profound historical knowledge exhibited by its author, this book deserves an A+. Happy for my part that England in 1534 was the first European country to decisively reject this wildly irrational ideology and accompanying institutions in their entirety. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.